Hey everyone, welcome to American History 1 Final Exam Review. At this point, you should have already taken the Unit 7 test, and all that's left now in American History 1 is the exam review unit. Before we start with the Unit 1 review, I need to explain how your review for American History 1 will work. So, unlike in the previous units, there's going to be no guided notes to print off and take with these PowerPoints. Instead, you need to take out a sheet of notebook paper and write down your own notes based off of the PowerPoint that we're about to go through. The PowerPoint's going to contain 25 of the most important topics from each unit, and then we'll go over them and you write them down on your notebook paper. And then with that notebook paper, you can use it on the review quiz at the end of each screencast. It should be a really simple quiz to take. It should really help your grade out as long as you use the notes that you take for the review. You can't use the screencast itself, or that will count, as a screen change, and you'll have points deducted from that. But you can use and you should use the notes that you take on your notebook paper from this PowerPoint. And then after we get through all the units of review, then you'll take your North Carolina final exam at your high school. So, with all of that in mind, let's begin. The first term we're going to talk about is the agricultural revolution. Prior to the agricultural revolution, you'll remember that these Native American tribes were mainly nomadic. That meant that they would follow different animal herds around, hunting them for food, and they never stayed in one place for very long. And so during the agricultural revolution, if you remember from world history, they might call this the Neolithic revolution. But anyway, what's going to happen is whenever people start to raise their own crops to eat, so instead of having to chase animals around, what they're going to do is plant crops such as maize, which is corn. They might plant squash. They're also going to start to domesticate animals. And so, whenever you have your animals domesticated, that means you're able to keep them maybe in a pen or in a field or something like that. You're not having to chase them. And with the crops, you're able to go out and harvest them whenever they're ready. And so, that is your food supply. You're not having to chase animals around anymore. And when you do that, civilizations are going to be able to pop up like the one in the picture here. When you're not having to worry about food and having to chase food around, you're able to start making a government and creating a society and stuff like that. And you're not really able to do that with the nomadic, they called it hunter gatherers. And that kind of went away with the agricultural revolution. The next thing that's kind of related to the agricultural revolution is the Columbian Exchange. And so the Columbian Exchange is whenever the Old World and the New World, which is the terms, Old World describes the European continent, the New World describes North and South America after Columbus came over in 1492 and established contact with the New World. Which is sort of misleading. It's not any older or newer than Europe, but it was just new to the Europeans. Anyway, the Columbian Exchange is what happens whenever Europe and North America and South America too start to exchange the products that are known in each country. And so, we talked about the crops. Well, something that happened is the New World would send over some of the crops that were grown, in the Americas to Europe, and then the same Europe would send some of their crops over to the Americas. And so that was a positive part of the Columbian Exchange. It wasn't always positive, though, because what would happen and what did happen is that a lot of the European disease would be sent over into the New World or into the Americas, and this would really devastate later on the Native American populations. A lot of them were wiped out completely, and it's because of this Columbian Exchange where not only did they send the crops over, which was beneficial, they also sent over disease, which obviously was not. And so now we're going to talk about the fall of the Spanish Armada, which kind of sets the stage for England being able to colonize in North America. So prior to 1588, Spain and Spain's navy, which they called the Armada, controlled the Atlantic Ocean. They were really powerful. They had a lot of ships in their fleet, and with that out in the Atlantic Ocean, England was really not able to sail across the Atlantic Ocean and try to establish colonies. In fact, the first colony established in St. Augustine, Florida, was a Spanish colony, and England was not able to get in on that because Spain was able to control the Atlantic Ocean with their navy. And so Spain and England are eventually going to fight over control of the Atlantic Ocean. And in 1588, England is going to be able to defeat the Spanish Armada in the Atlantic Ocean, and England will be able to start colonizing North America. However, the Atlantic Ocean was open. England was going to be able, it was able to go across and settle colonies just like Spain had been uh, prior to this. And it sort of sets up some competition between the two, but eventually England is going to be the most important of the colonies when it comes to the present day United States. And they were able to do that because the Spanish Armada was defeated. So some of those colonies that England was able to settle was the southern colonies, and we'll get to some of the other ones later on in this PowerPoint. But the southern colonies is all the way from the border here. I talked about St. Augustine down in Florida, controlled by Spain, Georgia, all the way up to the Carolinas and Virginia. And the southern colonies are going to be known for their climate, their environment, and they're going to be able to grow crops because it's really warm there. The soil is really fertile for crops and tobacco and stuff like that to grow. And whenever you're able to grow crops there and stuff like that, you can sell them to other countries, and that is the basis of their economy. And so they would sell, stuff like tobacco to England. Eventually, Jamestown, as you can see here on the map, is going to be saved because of uh, being able to sell tobacco, and that's because of their environment and their economy. And the southern colonies were really settled for economic reasons. The people that came to the southern colonies came because they wanted to make money. They were looking for gold. When that really didn't work out, they turned to growing crops uh, to sell and make money off of. And that's different from the New England colonies, which I will get to in just a minute. But the southern colonies, you just need to know that they are really, really big on agriculture, and they will be for years to come after this. So one of those southern colonies was Jamestown. So Jamestown was settled in what is now the state or the Commonwealth of Virginia, and Jamestown is going to be the first permanent English settlement in North America. So prior to Jamestown, there had been some attempts by England to settle in North America. You might have heard of the lost colony at Roanoke and stuff like that, but they didn't last. They all failed. Jamestown is the first one that's going to be able to survive past a few years. And, Jamestown could have not survived and failed like the other ones did because they're going to go through a starving time, if you remember talking about that, right after they were founded. During the starving time, they could not really grow crops. They didn't have much food, and it got to the extreme that some people started to dig up corpses that of the people that had died, and they would eat those corpses, and they would turn to killing their horses, killing their dogs to eat, because it was that bad. But Jamestown is going to be the first one that survived. And once a colony like Jamestown kind of showed England that a colony in North America could survive, then they're going to want to settle more and more colonies in North America. So Jamestown kind of opened the floodgate for more settlement by England in North America. So we talked about the basis of the southern economy just a while ago being agriculture. Well, you probably automatically think of cotton, but before cotton, the southern economy is really going to be based off of tobacco. And so, we just got done talking about the starving time in Jamestown. They didn't have much money, didn't have much food. But eventually, one of the Jamestown leaders, his name was John Rolfe, he is going to bring over some tobacco seeds and he's going to plant the tobacco seeds in Jamestown. And because Jamestown had, fertile soil and a warm environment, the tobacco is going to be able to grow there very, very well. And they could plant fields and fields of tobacco. They could harvest the tobacco and they would sell it off to England and other countries. This would make them money. They could buy the food they needed. They could attract more people to come to Jamestown because they were wealthier, and and this would help grow their population. And so, one more thing to talk about though with tobacco is that whenever you plant so many fields of tobacco, like the Jamestown colony did, you're going to have a lot of people to harvest that tobacco before you can sell it. And so eventually, people called indentured servants, which are people that are bound to a contract to work for a few years, but then they're released from that contract. They're going to start off harvesting the tobacco, but eventually, slaves are going to harvest the tobacco in Jamestown and elsewhere in the South. In fact, the first slaves that ever came to North America through Jamestown. So, another thing that Jamestown is really known for is their type of government. And so, in 1619, the House of Burgesses is going to be formed. And prior to 1619, the governor of Jamestown could really do what they wanted to. They could make decisions, and the people would just kind of be expected to follow those decisions. But whenever the House of Burgesses is going to be founded, it's going to be a representative government. A representative government means that people, the citizens of Jamestown, are going to elect people to represent them in this house. This is the House of Burgesses right here. And the people are going to go here and they're going to meet and talk about the issues that Jamestown has. And they would talk about, their economy. They talk about, how they're going to grow more tobacco, how they're going to get more people to come and live in Jamestown, how they're going to grow their population, how they're going to deal with Native Americans. And so they talk about all these issues and they would vote on them. And, they talk about taxes and stuff like that too. And that's going to be important because later on, whenever England tries to tighten its grip on Jamestown, they're going to be used, and not just Jamestown, all of the English colonies, they're going to be used to representing themselves and making their own decisions, like in the House of Burgesses. And they're not going to like it whenever England tries to reverse that. So, something when we talked about tobacco was indentured servitude. And so the headright system goes right along with that. The headright system was a way in which the wealthy people in Jamestown, and remember, the wealthy people in Jamestown, they're going to be the ones that own all of the tobacco, they're going to own all of the tobacco fields. And they're going to want people to come work in their tobacco fields, harvesting the tobacco, because if they have more tobacco, they'll make more money. Well, in order to encourage this growth of indentured servants coming to Jamestown, they come up with the headright system, where if a wealthy planter, is what they were called in Jamestown, would pay for the passage of an indentured servant coming across the Atlantic Ocean, they would give land, they would receive land from the English government. And so, if they have more land, they can plant more tobacco and they can grow Jamestown overall. Eventually, this will not work out because Jamestown, the indentured servants in Jamestown, are going to see that the land that they were promised, and remember, the indentured servants, whenever they were freed, they were promised some land. And eventually, these wealthy planters, because of the headright system, are going to have all of the good land. They're not going to have as much, and they're going to grow resentful over that, and that's going to cause a rebellion that we will talk about in just a minute. But the indentured servants, again, just to review, they were people in England. They were typically the poor people in England. Uh, they were looking for a new life. They wanted a fresh start. And they wanted that by coming to the colonies in North America. You know, they had just been discovered and settled by the English, and they knew that they could basically restart their life in North America. But typically, they could not afford a ticket on a boat to get across the Atlantic to uh, the Americas. And so, what they would say instead is, well, we will work in Jamestown or anywhere in the colonies for a few years. Typically, it was 4 to 7. And whenever they worked for these years, then they were freed. And they were also promised stuff in return for their work. The most important, though, is that they would want land whenever they were released from the end of their work period. And I talked about earlier, this land was not always available because the wealthy people in Jamestown typically had the best land, and whenever they tried to get their land at the end of their 4 to 7 years, they could not really grow much stuff there because uh, the planters had all of the good land, and so that's going to cause them some resentment later on, and eventually it's going to cause Bacon's Rebellion here. So Bacon's Rebellion is when a group of indentured servants, they're led by a guy named Nathaniel Bacon. What they did is they eventually got fed up with their conditions, their indentured servitude conditions, and what they did is they're going to rebel. They're going to burn Jamestown to the ground out of their frustration. And it was because they were not getting the land. They also would want to start a family. There are not many women available, in Jamestown because typically they didn't want to, you know, experience the harsh conditions that Jamestown was like. Uh, and they were just overall frustrated, and so they rebelled against the wealthy people in Jamestown. Another thing that the wealthy people did that they didn't like is that they would try to trade with the Native Americans, and they didn't like that because the Native Americans could fight them whenever they got pushed out to the west. These indentured servants, their land was typically out in the west where the Native Americans were. They would fight with them, and that was another thing that they didn't like. But the most important thing to remember about Bacon's Rebellion is that the people in Jamestown and elsewhere can see that they cannot trust the indentured servants to harvest the tobacco that they need, and that they're going to have to start looking toward an alternate source of labor. And so, what they're going to look to are slaves. A slave, is easier to control. They are not promised anything in return for their service. They are eventually going to be enslaved for life, and so they're just a lot easier to control. You don't have to pay them anything, and they're more reliable, for lack of a better word, than the indentured servants were. So we're going to shift now from Jamestown and the southern colonies to the New England colonies. So the New England colonies were settled right after Jamestown was. Jamestown was the first permanent one, but there were some that kind of came after Jamestown in New England. The first one is going to be Plymouth here. You probably heard of the Pilgrims, and they settle. Uh, in contrast to the South, they settle for religious reasons. So Jamestown and the southern colonies were all settled because the people wanted to make money. Well, in New England, they wanted to settle in the New World so they could practice their religion. So in England at this time, the king was supportive of the Church of England. And so there were people within England, like the Puritans, like the separatist Puritans, which founded Plymouth. They're going to be persecuted because they don't go along with the Church of England. And so they're going to come over to the English colonies trying to start kind of a refuge where they can practice their religion without being persecuted. And so another thing about the New England colonies is that up here, uh, north of where we are in North Carolina, the soil gets a lot more rockier, and so they're not going to be able to plant stuff as well. So they're going to have to look toward other ways um, to have their economy based on. So what they're going to do is build ships because there's a lot of timber up in New England where they can build those ships, and then they're also along the coast here, and they can go fishing and they can sell the fish and make money off of that. So we talked about the Plymouth colony. One aspect of that is the Mayflower Compact. So a compact is just another word for an agreement. And so, whenever the pilgrims came over on the Mayflower, all of the men on the Mayflower are going to get together and decide how they are going to govern themselves once they establish their colony. And so, what they decide to do is that whenever there's an issue that comes up in the Plymouth colony, they're going to vote on that issue, and whichever side has the majority will will have their part of the issue will go into effect. So if there was ever a disagreement, they would vote on it, and then if you had less people that agreed with you, then you wouldn't really get what you wanted, but the majority would. And so this is important because it showed that once the colonists would get to America, they had a plan, they had a way that they could govern themselves, and that really set them up for the long term. If they came over and didn't really have a way to govern themselves or control their society, things would fall apart pretty quickly. And so this was a way in which they could stop that from happening. So another thing along those lines is the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. So what the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut is the first written constitution in the colonies. So obviously it's going to be in Connecticut. The Connecticut colony is going to get together and they're going to write down like these men here are doing. And you know, again, like with the Mayflower Compact, it was the men that decided this. And so they're going to write down how they are going to govern themselves in Connecticut. And they're going to describe, you know, any type of um, power, how that power would be regulated, how it would be checked, how people would vote on their representatives, how those representatives should act when they are in power. And so this laid the basis for the United States Constitution because the United States Constitution does the same thing, but instead of describing how a colony is going to be ran, it describes how the country will be ran. But it's the same idea. You write down how your government is going to be structured, and then what the responsibilities of each part of that government is going to be. And so, Fundamental Orders of Connecticut is really, really important because it laid that framework for what would become the United States Constitution. So, another colony in New England, we talked about the Plymouth colony earlier, is the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So, like the Plymouth colony, the Massachusetts Bay Colony is going to be founded for religious reasons. Unlike the people in Jamestown and in the other southern colonies, they were not really interested in making a lot of money. They came over so they could purify the Church of England, and that's how they got their name, the Puritans. They wanted to, they looked at the Church of England and saw it as an institution that was corrupt and that needed to be reformed. And so they thought that if they came over and practiced their own religion, they could do that, and they would do that by providing a example to the world. They called themselves a city upon a hill. And so if you think of a city upon a hill, you look up, you know, you look up a hill and you sort of admire whatever is there because that's sort of an example that you can follow. And so they thought that if they modeled how a society should behave, a good Christian society should behave, then other colonies would do the same and other countries would do the same. In the end, they're going to do a lot of really unethical things that are probably not the greatest morals. Like you've probably heard of the Salem witch trials and stuff like that. They were not always a really good moral example, but that's what they wanted to be at least. And so the Puritans in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they were really strict. If anyone questioned what they did, that person was looked at as an outcast, as someone that you couldn't trust, or someone you should not respect. And one of those people was Roger Williams. So Roger Williams lived in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he disagreed with the Puritan leaders. Now, he really did not disagree with the theology or what the Puritans believed religiously. He just thought that people should be allowed to practice whatever religion they wanted. And the leaders in the Massachusetts Bay Colony would not allow for that. They wanted everyone in Massachusetts Bay to be a Puritan. And Roger Williams did not agree, and he voiced his opinion, and when he did, he was kicked out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And eventually, Roger Williams is going to go on to found the Rhode Island colony. And the Rhode Island colony is going to be, he's going to make it after his own beliefs, obviously. And Rhode Island is going to promote the freedom of religion. So even though Roger Williams was a Puritan, he allowed for the people in his Rhode Island colony to practice whatever religion they wanted, whether they were Jewish or Catholic or even Puritan. He didn't care as long as you could practice whatever and believe in whatever you wanted to. So, another thing about the New England colonies that we should talk about is their relationship with Native Americans. So the New England colonies were known for having a really big population. They had their families had a lot of kids. Some of them had up to 10, maybe even more than 10 kids per family. And people were constantly coming over from England on top of that. And so you're going to have somewhere to put all of these people. And so whenever the people in New England and in the southern colonies too, they would settle right along the coast. But as their population expanded, they would expand westward. And that's where the Native Americans were. So they would push the Native Americans further and further west off of their land, and the Native Americans are not going to like this because they view it as their land. They view the people in the New England colonies as like an invader to their land, and they're going to fight back. And so there's going to be a lot of wars before King Philip's War, a lot of battles between the New England colonists and the Native Americans. But King Philip's War, and by the way, King Philip was also called Metacom or something like that, I believe, in his Native American language. But he was the leader of the Native Americans up in New England. And this war was going to be the last time that they could fight um, over the land. The last time they put up an actual resistance to it. After this, they're going to be pushed west, and they really are not going to be able to fight back. So, in contrast to the Puritans that really were intolerant, they didn't want anyone to go against what they believed in. The Quakers are going to sort of be the opposite of that. So, the Quakers are going to be predominantly in the Pennsylvania colony. And what the Quakers are is a religious group. They were also called the Society of Friends. Um, they were in the middle colonies, like I said, in Pennsylvania. But what they believed in was religious freedom. And they felt that even though they were Quakers, they were sort of like Roger Williams in this belief. They thought that even though they were Quakers, you should be free to practice whatever religion you want, even if you're not a Quaker. And not only did they believe in religious freedom, they also thought that all of the races were equal along with the sexes. So men and women were equal, along with African Americans, Native Americans too. They believed that all people had what they called an inner light. Today we'd probably call that a soul. and they felt that since everyone had a soul, including the slaves, including the Native Americans, that all people should be treated with respect because of that. And that's not really something that we think of as controversial today. But back then, when a lot of the religious groups were intolerant of other groups, like the Puritans were, this was something that was new and something that we base a lot of our laws on today, of what the Quakers did. So, when we talk about the colonies and the basis of their economy, we also need to talk about triangular trade. And so, this picture is a really good representation of it. Basically, the colonies would trade with Europe, and then Europe would trade with Africa, and then they would trade with the colonies. And you can sort of see how it creates a triangle here across the Atlantic Ocean. And so, what's going to happen here, and they'd also go down to the West Indies too. A lot of, I believe, sugar was what they would trade for down in the West Indies. And so, with this trading, it was really, really profitable. They made a lot of money off of this trade. And so, they would sometimes trade stuff that was, not really a bad thing. They would trade products that they made in Britain. They would trade some of the crops that were harvested in the New World, like the tobacco from Jamestown that we just talked about. They would trade it back and forth like that, and they'd make money off of it. Really, no big deal. But what they would do, uh, the third leg of this triangle is the more important one to know, and that's slave trade. And so they would also trade slaves along with the products and the crops. And this passage across the Atlantic Ocean is going to be called the Middle Passage. You can see over here is a slave boat. They would come over to the African coastline. They would load up some slaves, and then they'd be brought to the New World to work on the crops and the plantations eventually. And this slave trade that gets started because of triangular trade is how most of the slaves in North America are going to be brought over, and they're going to be brought over to grow the crops so they can trade with Britain and other countries in Europe. So, something that motivated this triangular trade was a theory called mercantilism. So, mercantilism is an idea that a mother country, or just a country that is really powerful, if they get more money, if they become more wealthy, they're going to become more powerful. And so, they established that there is a correlation between the wealth of a country and that country's power. And so, because a country wants to be powerful, they're going to try to get more money. And a way that they can get money is through establishing colonies. So, the colonies in North America, we talked about tobacco, but there's also some natural resources in the colonies where there's timber and gold, silver. All of this stuff can be sold and can be, and you can make money off of it. The mother country can. And what they would do once they sold all of that, they would collect the profit off of it, and they would use that profit to maybe invest in their military, make their military stronger, and doing so would increase their power. So any way that they could use these colonies to make more money, they would, because they wanted to be more powerful. And so that's mercantilism. And eventually the colonies can see that they're being exploited and through mercantilism, and eventually they're going to put up a resistance to that. And one example of that mercantilism is the Navigation Acts. So the Navigation Acts is going to be passed by England, and it's going to impact the American colonies, or the British colonies, in what would become the United States. So, what England tried to do with these Navigation Acts is to control the trade that was happening between the colonies and other countries. So, what the colonies tried to do is make money for themselves by trading with other countries that were not England. So instead of selling some tobacco from Jamestown straight to England, they might sell it to France or they might sell it to Spain. And whenever they sell it to Spain, England is not really going to benefit as much from that. And remember, Spain has historically been a rival of England. And so, either way you look at it, England is going to be losing money because of this trade. And so, they're going to tighten this trade up, and they're basically going to tell the colonies that they can only trade with England. And so, the colonists are not going to like this, and what a lot of them are going to do is smuggle. And so, smuggle is just a way to say illegally trade. So, they would still trade with the other countries that I just talked about, but they'd have to do it illegally. And eventually, England will catch on to the fact that they are smuggling stuff and will try to tighten that smuggling up even more. And you probably hear of John Hancock whenever he signed the Declaration of Independence. He was the wealthiest person in the colonies, but he made most of his money through smuggling, and he had to do that because of the Navigation Acts. So, something that happened in the colonies, typically this happened in the New England colonies more so than in the southern colonies, is that there's going to be a time of religious revival. They're going to call this the Great Awakening. And so what's going to happen is that you're going to see preachers, especially in New England, like Jonathan Edwards. He's going to go out and preach. They called him hellfire and brimstone sermons, and he would basically accuse people of not being religious. If they're not religious, then he's telling people that they're going to be condemned to hell. That God is going to punish the colonies if they don't get their act together and try to become more religious, go back to church. Um, and this, like I said, happened pretty much in the New England colonies where the Puritans were. The southern colonies were not interested uh, as much in religion because they were there to make money. And so the Great Awakening, it might have tried to increase the fervor of the religious people in New England, but what it's going to do, more importantly for the future, is it's going to create a culture that is different in the colonies from England. And so when the colonists look at their culture and their religion as being different from England, then they're going to be able to say, well, we're not really like England. Let's try to be more like ourselves and establish our independence. So that'll play into the American Revolution later on. So, another thing kind of relating to religion is the Enlightenment. And so, what the Enlightenment did is that it kind of went against religion. It emphasized stuff like science and stuff that you can prove, and logic, the way you can sit down and logically think through a problem. And really, the Great Awakening was a reaction to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment kind of encouraged people to be less religious, while the Great Awakening encouraged people to be more religious. And so the Enlightenment is going to emphasize stuff called natural rights. And natural rights is going to be stuff that you are born with, and because you are a human, you're automatically entitled to those rights. And so, you might have the right to, and these people believed in the Enlightenment that you had the right to live under a government that respected you and that protected you. And we'll get to that later on. I don't want to go into too much detail now about it. But the Enlightenment is going to be really, really important because these ideas that come out of the Enlightenment are going to inspire our founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and Samuel Adams. It's going to inspire them to question the relationship between the colonies and England, and eventually that's going to cause the American Revolution. So, one of the most important people that come out of the Enlightenment, one of the most important thinkers of the Enlightenment is John Locke. And you can remember his name if you look at his hair here. He had many locks of hair. But anyway, John Locke is going to come up with the idea of people having the right to life, liberty, and property. Well, that phrase probably sounds familiar to you because in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson wrote that all people had the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So he changed property to the pursuit of happiness. But the fact that two out of those three words are in the document that founded our nation, uh, it's just a testament to how much the Enlightenment impacted um, the American Revolution and all the people that founded our nation. And so, what John Locke is going to say is that a government should protect people's life, liberty, and property. And he said that the only reason a government exists is because it should protect its citizens' lives, liberties, and their properties. And he came up with the idea of a compact theory to call this. And so, we just talked about how government should protect life, liberty, and property. Well, Locke said that if a government did not protect those natural rights, then the people had a right to overthrow that government and to establish a new government. And so, a lot of these ideals you see come up in the American Revolution. That's what the colonists did. They felt that the British government was not protecting their natural rights, so they had a right to get rid of that British government and come up with a new government that would protect their natural rights. And so this all goes back to John Locke and making sure that people had the ability to live under a government that is going to look out for them, look after their own best interest. And eventually, if people feel like they cannot trust their government to look after their own best interest, they're going to get fed up to the point uh, that they're going to overthrow that government or abolish that government, like John Locke said. So, the last key term we have out of the Unit 1 review is the Zinger trial. So, the Zinger trial, I believe, happened in New York. And there's a guy named John Peter Zinger. He wrote a article, I believe, in a newspaper, and he criticized the government. And now you can say stuff about the government that you want without really any second thought because you're free to do that. You're free to criticize the government. But that wasn't always a given back in the 1700s. And so, what this trial is going to do is going to be put on trial, and they're going to go through the court system. He's going to have a jury. They're going to listen to all the evidence, and at the end of this trial, they're going to say that he is not guilty for criticizing the government, that he shouldn't be punished for criticizing the government. And so this is really, really important because this will set up the future for freedom of the press, where people can write, where journalists can write whatever they want about the government in a newspaper, and they're not going to be, um, punished or have their rights taken away for doing that. And that's freedom of the press. And it's going to be in the Constitution of the United States later on. It's in the First Amendment. The very First Amendment uh, talks about freedom of the press, among other things. But, it's there largely because the Zinger trial established the precedent for this. And whenever you set a precedent to do something, it's really hard to go back against that precedent. So, really, really important. It established freedom of the press. So that is the end of the Unit 1 review PowerPoint. At this point, you should have all of the notes taken from these 25 key terms. So now you should use those notes on the review quiz. It should be a really easy grade for you to help boost your grade up a little bit.